Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
I was looking at the title for our today's program and just chuckling to myself, and I'd like you to introduce it. It's so creative.
Well, I'm inspired by Ben Stein. He has some really neat things. He had a really crazy program on Win Ben Stein's Money. He used to have these really strange titles for things. So I guess I've been inspired by him. And so today's program is called Crusader Castles and a Crafty Blind Venetian.
So cute.
Yeah.
I love it.
Well, this is in fact a Venetian, and he is in fact blind.
Okay.
And rather than have Venetian blinds, we're going to have a blind Venetian. He is no hero to the Crusades. No, not at all. He might have been a hero to the people of Venice, but he certainly wasn't. And we're going to be seeing some others who are not real heroes either.
Oh.
One of those is a man that we thought was a hero, or think is a hero, and he does a dastardly deed. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the first thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit about castles, because it was really the Hospitallers and some of the other knights in the Latin East that really perfect this castle building. And these things were, I think I mentioned last time around, that they were like the battleships of the Middle Ages. They were not battleships, aircraft carriers. They were like aircraft carriers of the Middle Ages. Their dimensions were huge. They projected power. They projected authority. And so anyway, I thought we'd start off looking at those. Looking at what becomes yet another crusade. This is the King's Crusade, and how that unfolds. And then we get into some rather complicated dynasties. And we'll take a look at one of those, and ultimately it's going to be sort of like the link into yet another crusade, the Fourth Crusade, which is the most disastrous of all of them. But anyway, you gotta admire these guys for hanging in there, but by golly,
they keep giving it a go anyway.
Yeah, they do that. Well, fortress building really becomes a fine art and a science by the Crusaders, and especially the Hospitallers. And they're going to influence the way that they build their fortresses is going to influence castle design for the next 300 years. The kind of thing that we think of typically as a castle in England or France or Germany or whatever, we really find the rudiments of this in the Christian East. Basically, in the very center, you've got what's called a keep. It's usually square, several stories high, and then there's an atrium around that, and then you have corners. There are towers in each of these corners, and so that's the innermost section of these castles. And then beyond that, you've got a wall way beyond that, and that's sort of a second line of walls, and these are wider and of course lower, so they afford the opportunity for archers, for instance, in the keep itself to be able to fire over the defenders of those outer walls. The idea actually comes from Constantinople, the wall system that protects that city and does very successfully against many Muslim attacks. Is going to inspire this idea that these Crusaders are going to come up with in that. So if you can imagine, just in your mind's eye, these walls that are themselves covered, so that it's sort of like a vaulted halls actually going through the interior of these walls. Now, the idea behind that is it allows for safe movement, so that if you're attacked over on the north side, you can take your men, the excess men from the west side, move them from one side to the other, and they're not going to be exposed.
Right.
So they're kind of vaulted interior passageways. Now, outside the wall itself is a ditch or a moat. And typically, these things were quite large. They were typically about 20 feet wide and about 30 feet deep.
Wow.
And they allowed for, well, they made it very difficult to get ladders, tack ladders in. So you can imagine that if you were able to get a ladder up there, going 30 feet deep, you could basically climb to the bottom of the hill.
Right.
The bottom of the wall.
Uh-huh.
That was about it. Otherwise, you're going to have a ladder that's going to be 50 or 60 feet long. And back in the Middle Ages, they just don't have those extension ladders like we do today. So that's important. And in the Holy Land, in many cases, this was literally cut into rock. These castles were placed on top of a rock of a mountain, and so they were literally cut in. When possible, you would fill it with water, and so that's the moat. That's what we're all familiar with that. You see them all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, in a lot of cases, they didn't have water to fill, and so what they did was instead they planted thistle and all kinds of thorny bushes, which would make it very uncomfortable for someone to attack. But when you could, you filled it with water. And then the water would be used for livestock and also for summer refreshment, literally just bathing in, because it's hot.
Right.
In that part of the world, it's pretty darn hot. The drinking water itself was not used for human drinking. The drinking water was stored inside in the central courtyard. And to give you an example of this, in one of the truly great castles of the Middle East, it's called Crac, C-R-A-C, and they had enough provisions there to hold off a siege for 5 years.
Oh my gosh.
They had that much. It was provisioned that much. So you can imagine the incredible amounts of water that would be there, and grain, livestock, the whole works. But you could keep an entire garrison there for 5 years. After 5 years, the other side's going to give up, or you'll get some kind of, the cavalry will arrive or something. But that's what it's designed to do. And in fact, in this particular one, and by the way, I think I mentioned that last time around, one of the really neat books on this is a book by H.J.A. Sire, S-I-R-E, and it's called The Knights of Malta. And he has a whole chapter that describes these castles, the Hospitallers' castles. But in this particular one, you have, to get in, you had to go through 2 hairpin turns. And the idea behind these hairpin turns is it's very easy for a defender. So that as you're coming in, for instance, if you made a hairpin turn, as you're coming in and have to make a hard right, that would mean that you're disabled from using your right hand. You'd have to use your left hand for your weapon. And since the majority of people were right-handed, remember that the medieval sign that you mean no harm is to take your right arm or right hand and show it to your enemy. That's where the wave came from, right?
Oh my gosh! No, I didn't know that.
Oh really? Oh
no.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Nobody waves with their left hand.
No. Okay.
But a knight would wave with his right hand to show that he was not carrying arms. And so if you were attacking in there and made that hairpin right turn, the defender would be able to use his right arm in order to hack at you with a axe, battle axe, a halberd, a sword, whatever. You, on the other hand, are basically disarmed on your right side.
Mm-hmm.
So very, very clever the way that they came up with these things. Crac, it was actually built to garrison 2,000 men. And typically what happened was that the young men would be in these castles. The older Hospitallers, the older Templars, the older knights in general, usually would be shipped back to Europe to do behind-the-scenes duty. But the the young men would be up there in front on the line itself. However, the reality is that by 1200, the knights could never get more than 300 knights in all of the Middle East. There's one example in 1265. At one siege at the castle of Arshur, it went on for 40 days, not 5 years, just 40 days. And the entire castle was defended by only 270 men.
Wow.
That was it. So, they're provisioned for 1,000 or more, but there were only 270 men, and 90 of them were killed in those 40 days, and the other 180 were then taken taken as prisoners. Now, that meant that half of all the armed hospitallers in the entire East were lost in that one battle.
Wow.
So there's always going to be a shortage of manpower. So these castles, you can imagine, again, let's go back to the aircraft carrier. And if you could imagine an aircraft carrier with 1/10 the number of men that are needed to run that aircraft carrier, you can imagine that they would be having some real problems. When Croc itself fell in 1271, remember it was...
Oh, it did? Okay.
Yes, it did, yeah. It had been set up for 2,000 men,
okay.
And it was defended by 200 hospitallers. That was all.
Okay.
So
that's why...
And that's why it fell, yeah. Well, before all of those things happened, we have another crusade. This is the Third Crusade, and it was authorized by Pope Gregory VIII. And rather early on, it was responded to again by kings. Remember the previous crusade, we had Louis and Conrad,
right.
Who had gotten involved in. This time, it was an English and a French king. The two of them were at war with each other. And so when Pope Gregory called upon the nobles of Europe for this new crusade, which would be the Third Crusade now, the two kings then settled their differences. This was King Henry II of England. And his counterpart in France was Philip Augustus, or Philip II of France. They made a truce, and they planned to go on crusade. Not together, but they were still friendly. But Henry died. Even before he got underway, he had planned to take the pilgrim route, and died before he could even farm together. He had a son who offered to take his place, and nobody thought much of this. His name was Richard of Poitou, and he was a raucous character, rebellious, not exactly the kind of guy that would take up the cross and go to the Holy Land. But nonetheless, he took this vow to follow his father's, basically to take up his father's vow. And it changed him. It absolutely changed him. And in history, he's known as Richard I. His French title is Coeur de Lion, Heart of the Lion. This is Richard the Lionhearted.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He immediately signs another truce with Philip to assure him that he would not attack the French while Philip is on crusade. And they both agreed that whatever they did in the Holy Land, they would divide it up evenly between the two of them. So they're going to go, but they're going to go as conquerors. Their intention is to basically redivide the Holy Land and reestablish, I guess, in a sense, kingdoms, but along their own lines, rather than reestablish those four kingdoms, which of course are now a couple generations in memory. So that was their decision. They had very difficult relations. And part of the reason for that is that the King of England is also the Duke of Normandy, which makes him technically a vassal to the King of France. Technically.
Right.
And that technicality ultimately in another generation is going to lead to the 100 Years' War, but not at this point. It's just a sore spot. Okay, it's not enough to cause another war, but it's a sore spot. Anyhow, the English then assemble a fleet, and it's paid for by what's known as the Saladin tithe. This was imposed all throughout England on everybody who was not himself a crusader, would have to pay a 10% tithe on all of his wealth, and that money was then used to build a fleet, which the English then used to sail to the Holy Land. Their intention was to go along the west coast of Europe, go through Gibraltar, and then across the Mediterranean. So that was the route that the English were going to take. The French, on the other hand, didn't build a fleet, but they hired a fleet. They rented the fleet from the city of Genoa. And so with that, they moved their soldiers down to there. Now, way over in Germany, the emperor over there hears that the King of France and the King of England are going on a crusade, and he thinks to himself, well, wait a minute, what about me? And so he volunteers also to join this group. Now, he's an old man by this point. His name is Friedrich I, Friedrich the Redbeard, or Barbarossa. So Friedrich Barbarossa gathers together his men. Now, interestingly enough, he's not exactly the most fit warrior in the world at this point. He's, like I say, he's pretty old, but he's probably the best general Europe's produced in a couple hundred years. And he looks at war as a science. Most of them think of it as sort of a blood sport, but he looks at it as a science. And what he does is he innovates with bowmen. He improves the range of bowmen. He gets them into the infantry, and they actually have a better range than the Turkish bowmen do. He also actually develops cavalry tactics rather than just these wild charges that everybody else is. He's actually using cavalry like they hadn't been used in centuries. So very, very smart man. He makes his way to the Holy Land also. And when he gets he goes beyond Constantinople, he gets over into present-day Turkey, into Anatolia, and the Turks attack him, and they get mauled. Battle after battle, he is just really very successful. He puts a siege on Iconium. He captures a lot of the treasure and the riches of and provisions. And he's so successful that the Sultan of Rum, okay, you know, remember Rum is basically Turkey. The Sultan of Rum actually offers him free passage to the Holy Land.
Wow.
I won't attack you if you don't attack me, and I'll help you get
through.
Yeah, that's right. Just go. You know? And so he does, and he takes with him his army of some 20,000 troops. This is great success, and it looks like everything's going to be just wonderful. Well, Turkey is rugged terrain. He gets into some really rugged terrain. It's very hot in June, and as they're working their way through, he comes to a small river. It's called the Kalikadnos River, and as I say, it's a small mountain river, but it's very swift and very narrow. And unfortunately for Frederick and for the Germans, he fell from his horse. And chroniclers are not real sure what happened, but he was crossing this little river. The horse might have slipped. He might have fallen off his horse. Who knows? But the bottom line is he's an old man. He's wearing chainmail armor. He's wearing that quilting underneath, and it immediately takes on water. He immediately sinks to the bottom. It's not a deep river. I mean, you know, it's like knee deep, but you can drown in a bathtub.
Right.
And basically that's what happens is he drowns in a couple feet of water before his aides could get to him. Morale collapsed. There was nobody of the stature of Friedrich Barbarossa. And as a result, they decide to divide the army into 3 columns. Again, you've got the provisions thing, logistics. And so two of the columns made their way to Tarsus, which is on, remember, St. Paul's from Tarsus.
Right.
And it's on the coast. They were able to get ships and then go from Tarsus to Antioch to Tripoli. All of this done by sea. One of the columns was not able to do that. Instead, it marched by land to Antioch. But between the heat and the disease, almost all of them died. So this is what's left of this German wing of the Third Crusade. Is going to be those 2 columns on ships making their way down to the Holy Land. We'll come back to them later. Okay. Switch over to Richard. Richard's in his ships. He's making his way through the Atlantic, now into the Mediterranean, and his ships head for Sicily, which would be natural anyway. It's a large island, could be reprovisioned, all that. But he has another reason to go to Sicily. He decides to stay over winter. He's going to overwinter in Sicily. But the secondary reason for that is that his sister had been the queen of Sicily. She had been given her betrothed to King William II of Sicily, who had since died. And many of you remember these Sicilian Normans are pretty ruckus characters, and of course Richard is Norman himself, and so these various Norman Sicilian nobles don't want to recognize his sister as queen, and so one of the things he does is he stays in Sicily that winter in order to use his Crusader muscle on other Catholics. And so he eventually even besieges and takes the city of Messina, and well, anyway, a good number of Sicilians die in this battle. And in the back of their mind, the English Crusaders are thinking to themselves, wait a minute, this isn't why we came.
We didn't come to Sicily.
Well, anyhow, think of it. That's in the back of their mind. Okay, but they're still saying, okay, but we're on a crusade. Okay, we're going there. We'll get there. Then, eventually in the spring, they set sail, sailing east. A huge storm comes up. The fleet is scattered. And as they begin trying to get the fleet back together, remember, this is difficult. There's no communications. You don't have compasses, astrolabes, any of the sorts of things that you use for navigation today. And so it's very, very difficult to get this fleet back together again. And one of the ships ends up making its way to Cyprus. And there it lands in Cyprus, thinking, oh boy, thank goodness we're at Cyprus, and Christian island, and they'll take care of us and all. On board of that ship was Richard's fiancée. And anyway, the ruler of Cyprus sends messages out to Richard's fleet. By the way, we have this woman who says that she's your fiancée, and for a hefty sum, I'll give her back. He basically kidnaps the future Queen of England. So what does Richard do? He invades Cyprus and basically took over the entire island. Later on, he'll actually sell it to Guy de Lusignan, and we saw Guy last time around. His descendants will actually be the rulers of Cyprus for the next several centuries, until the 1400s, when the Turks come back and take over the island again. Well, now think of it: English Crusaders in the back of their mind going, "Is this why we went on crusades?"
Right.
Now, anyway,
Saving your family and your fiance.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Richard the Lionhearted is this great hero in Western history, but there's another side to this guy. Anyway, the Third Crusade then begins taking shape at the port city of Acre. Okay. More and more Crusaders begin to gather around Acre. Now, Acre had been taken by Saladin, and And so what they did was they invested the army, the Christian army began gathering and then investing the city itself into a siege. They didn't have enough men to do this until the Germans arrived. Remember those 2 columns of Germans that had made their way by sea. And so the 2 columns of Germans then add to the Crusader siege of Acre. Then a Christian fleet arrives, and now they're able to blockade the city from the sea itself. And with that, Saladin keeps attacking the besiegers, but every time he does, he gets repulsed. By April, the French Crusaders have arrived. By June, the English Crusaders have arrived. This after having taken island after island in the Mediterranean. The thing that the English brought with them, which the French had forgotten and the Germans didn't have and nobody else had, was siege material. They had the equipment to lay a siege, and so now they begin lobbing in with catapults. They begin lobbing big stones and fireballs, and with that, the city then surrendered. The surrender takes place on July 12th of 1191. Now, as a result of the surrender, everyone in Acre is allowed to leave the city who wants to leave. And then it becomes a Christian port city. However, Richard and Philip thought it would be best to keep some 3,000 hostages. Now, the reason for these would be they would be used later on to exchange for Christian hostages, because Saladin had hostages also. And he also had something else that they wanted very badly, which was a relic of the True Cross. That had been captured at the Battle of Hattin, which we talked about before, the Horns of Hattin last time around. Remember, that was that thirsty battle. Well, so that was the idea. And then all of a sudden, after having won this victory at Acre, Philip Augustus says to Richard, he says, "I'm not feeling real good. I think I better go home." And so he does. First of all, he's received word that his son in France is near death. He is, in fact, ill. And there's a third cynical reason for this, too. By him going back to France and leaving all those French nobles there, it was an opportunity for him to kind of strong-arm the nobility of France and get some concessions out of the noble families. So it's got a 3-part kind of a meaning behind it. Anyway, that's it. So now you've got a dead king, Friedrich Barbarossa. Now you've got an absent king, Philip Augustus, and now you've got one king left, and that's Richard the Lionhearted. Richard then begins to make plans to march from Acre to Jerusalem. He's going to be doing this in August. It's going to be a rough trip.
Okay.
Under good circumstances. These are not good circumstances. And quite honestly, bringing those 3,000 hostages would just, you'd have to feed them, you'd have to give them water, you'd have to guard them. It's not worth it. On August 16th, he slaughtered them all.
Oh, man.
3,000 people killed. Now, that's why, as I say, this is a man who has a wonderful reputation, but he does a couple dastardly deeds. This has to be one of the worst. And if you're an English crusader, you have to be thinking to yourself, what am I doing?
Right.
Anyway, they're marching on their way down to Jerusalem, and so he's able to keep everybody in line because, the ultimate goal is before them. So as they're marching down, they're marching along the coast. Immediately to the west, in the Mediterranean, is a fleet of ships that are constantly supplying them with the food that they need, the water that they need, everything else. Because quite honestly, as they're marching down, every river they come to is dried up. It's the middle of summer. Nothing is dry riverbeds wherever you go. And food shortages. So much so that there are stories about how in battles, if a war horse is killed, rather than abandon the horse, they literally dismembered the horse and ate it that night. They were that hungry to be able to have to do that. Anyway, they get down to Jerusalem. They sit out the winter. It's rainy. It's ugly. They can't siege. They left their siege material behind. Jerusalem's too big to get in. The walls are too high. The defenders are too good. And so what does Richard do? He turns around, takes his army, and marches it down to Ascalon, and takes the city of Ascalon. It falls to Richard. At least he's got something.
Okay.
It's at this point that many of his crusaders finally say, okay, fine, this is it. We're out of here. And they take the next ship home. They simply abandon him. So by the time you get to the spring of 1192, Richard the Lionhearted is in bad shape. His army is depleted. Most of those French soldiers or those French nobles are getting word back from France that, hey, you better get back here. Philip is taking our castles. Philip is doing this. Philip is doing that. Most of the Germans had no love for this crusade anymore. They did what they had to do. They're not going to run around and risk their lives for the King of England so that he can take cities for himself. And most of the English knights were pretty disgusted also. And so there's a huge desertion from this Third Crusade. The one thing that saves Richard is that Saladin is just bad as shape. He has many enemies within the Muslim community. There are many people afraid of him, Muslims, as there are Christians afraid of him. He has one ally he can really count on, and he's a Christian. His name is Conrad of Montferrat. And Conrad is assassinated. He's assassinated by, remember we talked earlier on about the Hasasim, the assassins? He is assassinated by a suicidal assassin who basically comes up, stabs Conrad, and then of course is cut down himself. Well, then Richard finds out that he gets news back from home too, that things are not going real well back in England. Merry old England is now being ravaged by his kid brother, John. You remember evil King John, fields of Runnymede, all that. And it looked as though John was staging a coup. So now Richard has to get out of the Holy Land real fast too and get back home. So what he does is he makes some fast moves. First of all, he sells Cyprus to Guy. Okay, takes that money. And then he tries to solve some fast problems, some issues in the Holy Land to stabilize things so that he can leave. And one of the things he does is he convinces his nephew, Count Henry of Champagne, to marry the widow of Conrad of Montferrat. Okay. The idea there is it's going to set up a dynasty so that you can rally around this dynasty. It's a combination of the English Norman bloodline with a French, Latin, Middle East line and all of this. So that was the idea. Her name is Isabella. We'll talk about her in a little bit later on. She's quite extraordinary. But anyway, there's one more season of fighting that happens. Saladin fails to take Jaffa. He can hold Jerusalem, but he can't take Jaffa. Richard can't take Jerusalem, but he can hold Jaffa. So it's a stalemate. He himself gets ill, and so what he does is makes a deal. He makes a deal with Saladin. And the truce is this, that the Latins will be able to keep Jaffa and Tyre, okay, as port cities. The city of Ascalon will be totally leveled. It will not be able to be used as a fortress in any way. Saladin can keep Jerusalem, but the Christians who went on the crusade will be allowed to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to celebrate Mass, and that Jerusalem will be open for Christian pilgrims, protected by Saladin, and also for trade. And this whole thing is sealed with the most incredible scene you could ever imagine. All the Crusaders march into Jerusalem under the eyes of the Muslims, under the eyes of Saladin. They march into Jerusalem, go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They pray there, celebrate Mass. They then leave Jerusalem, march all the way to Joppa, get on their ships, and go home.
Wow.
Okay. That's incredible. Absolutely incredible. Well, they go home, but not Richard. Richard makes his way by way of the Danube River, heading up. That's a big mistake, because he gets about as far as Vienna when he's overwhelmed, and he's kidnapped and then held for ransom. Now, the man that does this is Duke Leopold V of Austria, who is his cousin, if you can imagine. Eventually, there's no word about where he is, or eventually he's discovered in a fortress in Worms in Germany. And there is a ransom that is made of 65,000 pounds of silver. 65,000 pounds of silver is given for his ransom. All of England, except his brother John, raised the money, and he's freed in February of 1194. And I'll talk a little bit more about him a little bit later on.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, as I say, now sitting in the east basically is Saladin, who has successfully defended the city of Jerusalem against this third crusade.
Right.
But he's compromised with the Crusaders.
The Crusaders.
Yeah. And he himself begins making his own provisions for a pilgrimage to Mecca. He's going to make the Hajj, and he's excited about doing that. Before he does that, he has some renovations he has to do in Jerusalem to rebuild some of the city, and he dies on March 4th of 1193 in Jerusalem, not having been able to go to Mecca after all. He is undoubtedly, throughout Muslim history, one of the greatest figures, and even to this day, Muslim warlords compare themselves to Saladin. Saddam Hussein thought he was the new Saladin, and so he's sort of like the benchmark of Muslim leadership. Before we go much further than that, I guess I should mention. Let's go back to Isabella.
Yeah,
remember,
right.
She's a widow. She's been married off to Count Henry of Champagne. Henry dies. Now she's a widow again. Actually, she's a third-time widow. Her life is absolutely phenomenal. She was first betrothed when she was 11 years old.
Oh, man.
And at 17 years old, she was married to Humphrey of Toron. And this was in 1183. They were married at the castle of Croc.
Oh.
Okay. At the Hospitallers' castle. And they were married during a siege.
Oh my gosh.
If you could imagine, Croc was under attack by none other than Saladin. And there they are after the marriage. Now, this is a really wonderful story. Her mother is also in that castle at the wedding. Okay. And she's upset because Saladin and his forces are attacking and they can't sleep at night. So she sends a letter. This is the mother of Isabella. Okay. Sends a letter to Saladin saying, don't you have any respect? We just had a wedding here, and this couple is trying to have their wedding night. And so Saladin turns around to the messenger who's carried the message, and he says, where is the wedding couple? Where are they? In the castle. and the messenger says, well, it's this tower over there.
Oh, no.
Saladin gave orders to his men not to attack that tower that night so that they could have their wedding night.
No way. I thought he was like going to use that like, boom, okay, right.
No.
Oh, my gosh.
This is wonderful stories.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, I just was sure he was like, aha, now we know where they are.
The Middle Ages are full of just incredible stories.
Oh, my gosh.
You know, the human pathos is just
Right,
there it is.
right. It is.
So, you know, the wedding night of 1183. Ultimately, from all intents and purposes, the two of them are happily married,
Okay.
Isabella and Humphrey. But in 1192, because of dynastic concerns in the Middle East, she is forced to divorce Humphrey. And there's some trumped-up charges on, you know, that it was an invalid marriage, and I don't know how they ended up doing that. But in the end, she had to divorce Henry. I assume that an annulment came through, and then she was married to Conrad of Montferrat,
Okay.
who then, of course, was assassinated. And in 1192, she's then married through the efforts of Richard the Lionhearted to Henry of Champagne. In 1197, she's then married off again to Almeri, also known as Almerac. And in 1205, Almerac dies, along with their 4-year-old son, Almerac Jr., and then Isabella dies also. So it's just an incredible life, but she has one more marriage to go through before this is all done.
Oh, my goodness.
Almerac is the brother of Guy. And again, this is another attempt to found a dynasty, a European Christian dynasty in the Middle East, because the concept is we have a very national concept today of a people forming a nation, but the concept in the Middle Ages was much more in terms of a nation forming around a dynasty, and so that's what they're trying to pull off there, and not able to do that terribly well. And as I say, then you had these various marriages. When Isabella died off and her son died off, she has a daughter. Her name is Mary, and Mary then is the queen of Jerusalem, if you could call it that. Now, of course, you have to put that in quotation marks because Jerusalem wasn't in their control. They only had two
Right.
port cities. But she marries a man, we assume it's for love, because it's not for money and not for power or prestige, but he's a common French knight. His name is John de Brienne. And it turns out that he is one of the great soldiers of the Crusades. He's an incredible man-at-arms, and evidently just a very attractive man. Somebody that you would go into battle with. Mm-hmm. And so she marries him, a commoner for all practical purposes, but he's a great soldier. We'll talk a little bit more about him, but he makes an appeal to the Pope for help. And this is going to be Pope Innocent III. And Innocent is in 1216 proclaims yet another crusade. And with that, he sends legates to Richard, the Lionhearted, to Philip Augustus, and he's not going to have success because by the time the papal messenger arrives, Richard has been killed. It's a very interesting way in which he dies too. It's a siege. He's laying siege to a French small French city.
Okay.
And as they're laying siege, one of the defenders is this an archer, and he has a crossbow. but he doesn't have any armor. And he's up on this tower. You can imagine this. He's up on his tower, and he's taking his crossbow and he's firing it. And then he gets down and he picks another dart, And as he's doing that, the only armor he has is a frying pan.
Oh my gosh!
You can imagine this. This guy's up there and he's deflecting English arrows with a frying pan. Well, the king is so just taken with the courage of this man that Richard goes onto the battlefield and begins clapping. He's applauding the courage of this French bowman. The bowman responds by shooting him. Shot him right in the arm. Struck his left shoulder. The wound festered. 2 weeks later, the King of England is dead. So, boom.
Oh my gosh.
In France, the papal messenger has a little bit more success. He is able to convince Count Theobald of Champagne. Now, this is the brother of Henry. Remember Henry, who had married Isabella, one of the husbands of Isabella, to join in the crusade. Now, Theobald has an idea, and what he does instead of going around and preaching for this crusade, what he does is he calls forth a tournament in Champagne. There's going to be this great tournament, and so nobles and knights and everybody come, and they're going to joust and fight and all this kind of stuff, and drink and carouse and have a good old time. And so there they gather together in this great big tournament, and in the middle of having all this wonderful time, Count Theobald turns around and says, I'm joining the Crusades. The Pope has called for a crusade to save the Holy Land, and I'm joining. Anybody want to come with me? Well, they're all in a great mood, and so that's how he's able to gather together all of these knights to go on this crusade. In early 1200, the Crusaders assembled in France. They begin to strategize. How are we going to do this? Somebody comes up with a strategy, and they decide that the strength of the Holy Land, the Muslim strength, is in Egypt. And so what they decide to do is to attack Egypt. And by way of Egypt, then they would be able to weaken the Muslim. By attacking Egypt, they would be able to weaken Muslim power and then make their way to the Holy Land. So that's how they're going to do this. But their problem is they need a navy. And they look around and they make a deal with the city of Venice.
Okay.
Now, the deal was this, that they were going to contract the entire fleet of Venice for 55,000 pounds of silver. And Venice would supply enough warships to transport 33,500 men. Okay, that's the deal. So what this is a big deal for the Venetians, because it basically means that for an entire year, none of their fleet can be used for anything else. They can't do any trade, any commerce, nothing like that. That means that the other port cities, Amalfi and Genoa and Pisa and Naples and all, they can basically commercially eat their lunch. There's no competition, or the competition takes over for one whole year. The Venetians then make another deal. They've got another 50 warships, and they'll throw that in exchange for 50% of all the war booty that comes out of this. Well, the Crusaders go, oh yeah, okay, that sounds good. Well, this is a huge cost up front for the city of Venice. And anyway, besides the fleet that they had, they also had to build more ships. So it's a huge investment on their part. And then what happens is the crusade poops out. The Crusaders are not able to get 33,500 men. They were lucky to get 11,000. And so when they show up in Venice, 11,000, it's less than one-third. And basically the head of Venice, the name of that is the Doge, or the Doge. The Doge of Venice is a man by the name of Dandolo. and he's blind. Okay, but he basically said, "I'll give you a month. I'll give you a month for the other 20,000 to show up. Otherwise, we leave at the end of the month. And if you only have 11,000 tough, you still owe me the 55,000 pounds of silver." So the Crusaders then were eventually able to find 37,000 pounds of silver. So there's still 18,000 pounds left. Dandolo is caught between a rock and a hard spot. He's got the fleet. He's put up the money. He's got all the expenses. And he's not covering his expenses with what they have. Mm-hmm. They don't have any more to come up with. So he decides to do something else. He's got to compromise. And he says, "I'll tell you what, we'll sail. And on our way down the Adriatic, there just happens to be a city over on the Balkan side that is a real gnat. It's a real problem for us. We have a hard time with these people. It's the city of Zara, okay, a port city. And I'll tell you what, it's in along the coast of Croatia. We'll put in there, and then you'll use your muscle, and that'll take care of the other 18,000 pounds of silver." Now the Crusaders are trapped. Mm-hmm. What are they going to do? And ultimately, the papal legate who was with the fleet, the Pope Innocent had sent him to go along with the fleet. His name is Peter Capuano, and Peter Capuano was a cardinal, okay, and he knew that Zara was under papal protection. It's a Christian city.
Oh.
And he knew that the Crusaders could not legitimately attack this city. And but on the other hand, he wants to see this crusade take place. And so what he does is this. He then tells the chaplains, he gathers together all of the chaplains of this crusade and tells them, "Look, the Crusaders cannot attack this city, but don't tell them that. And when we get to Zara," and then, so in other words, Dandolo will think that he's going to attack, but when he gets there, then we'll spring it on the Crusaders and say, "You can't really attack."
Okay.
Okay, so that's his plan.
Uh-huh.
He's going to double cross the Venetians, mm-hmm. and at the same time keep the crusade going. Okay, so that's what he's thinking about. Well, the Doge Dandolo is no dummy. He might be blind, but he can see through this plot. Uh-huh. And he knows that he knew that Zara is under papal protection, and he couldn't figure out why the papal legate wouldn't say anything until he figures out that what's going to happen is he's going to let the Crusaders go, get halfway there, then spring it, and then the Venetians are the ones that are going to have egg on their face. So he thinks, no, we're not going to go for that. So what he did was he turns around to Cardinal Capuano and says, "Oh, by the way, you're not going. We're not letting you on any of our ships." And so the poor cardinal had to go back to Rome to report back to Innocent III that he had failed. He may be failed. He doesn't know. It all depends on what those chaplains do. Yeah. So in October of 1202, there are some 50 transports head out of Venice, along with 100 horse and supply transports, along with another 100 war galleys. So this is a huge fleet of 210 ships. Wow. Sailing down the Adriatic with this great crusade. They got as far as Zara, and just over to one side of Zara, they land this entire army. The Zarans take a look at this thing, and they go, "Oh, we're in trouble," and they immediately offer to surrender. Okay, well, some of the chaplains go over to Zara and say, "Don't worry, you're under papal protection. Don't surrender to the Venetians yet. Hang on for a while, and you'll be able to get more out of the deal."
Oh my gosh.
It's around that time that a letter arrives from Pope Innocent III to the Crusaders and says anyone who attacks Zara is excommunicated. Now they're in a real dilemma. On November 24th of 1202, some of the Crusaders said, "This is ridiculous. We're out of here," and they hired a boat and they went back to Europe. Most of them, however, stayed. And what will happen is that they will attack the city of Zara. It's a terrible thing, and the long and short of it is, this is hard to say, the entire Fourth Crusade was excommunicated.
Yep. Wow. Oh my goodness, Father. The Crusades. What do you say? What can you say?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Well, how are we doing on
All the
time?
deals. We have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. Well, let's just say that what happens after this gets more ugly.
Uh-oh.
All these excommunicated Crusaders now make their way to Constantinople. And there they find themselves again outmaneuvered by this Dandolo. They get there, and by now the crusade has taken almost 9 months just to get that far. That's how much they had provisioned for. So now they're running out of food. And again, they find themselves in a situation in which they're going to have to do some very ugly things in order to save their crusade. But what a situation they're in. Excommunicated,
right.
The whole works. So the next time around when we get back together, the title of this is The Fourth Crusade, Disaster in the East. So there we are.
The foreboding begins, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, goodness. That has not been pretty.
No, it has not. I think maybe one of our lessons here is before we go jumping at arms, maybe we might want to think about other possible ways.
Yes. I think that's a wise call.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Father. Can we close today with a prayer and your blessing?
Sure enough. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.